Hey guys, what's going on? We're going to go ahead and work in React today, and if you saw the previous video, we showed you how to set up a simple, stupid app, and at the end we even spun one up using the Create React App CLI. Super handy, super useful, and that's what we're using here today. So if you didn't watch that, make sure you go check that out. So we've already spun up one application we get out of the box here, and what we're going to do today is try to start the beginnings of an application, and we're going to make it some kind of fantasy football app. Maybe we can rank players, but fantasy football, sports. I love football. We're down here in Texas, so we're going to go ahead and make a football application. Now remember, with the Create React app, we're getting a lot of advanced cool little tools like a development server. It's being built with Webpack. We have a linter built in, and we can make changes to the already working application. Hit save. Those changes are updated in the browser. So a lot of cool benefits with the CLI tool, and we'll definitely go into those deeper as we continue. Now, if you navigate over to the Hello World file found in the components folder, you'll see a very simple component, and we call this a function component because it's literally a function returning this JSX object. There's no state, there's no class involved, and we'll see the difference between what a function component is and what a component class is. So let's go ahead and make one of those new components. We'll call it player. We'll hold player information here. We'll use it on the page. So first, we'll have to go ahead and import React. And then because we're making this a special class component, we'll actually need to import this component class that we actually get from React. Notice I actually have to put it in these curly cues here because I'm explicitly importing that versus React, which is the default export from the library. Now I'm just going to say class player extends component because we're going to build upon the component that we get from React. Then go ahead and set up your constructor. Make sure you put the super call in there. We'll come back to what super is doing for us. And then we have a render method that we'll define, and then it actually returns the JSX object that we want to then return. Before we go forward, let's go back to the super call and what that's actually doing for us. So according to the React documentation, it specifies that you always need the super call when defining a constructor of a subclass. So we are making a subclass of the component, right? So then if we go a little deeper and actually look up the actual definition, we see that super keyword is used to access and call function of an object's parent. So the super call is initializing some goodies for us underneath the hood for the actual component. Things such as setting the values of the parent's constructor. We can pass those in through super. If you look at the React documentation, they will recommend passing in props through that super call so it can go to the parent's constructor, but mainly so you can access props within the constructor. So you can say something like this.props. We're not doing that right now. We're just accessing state, so we'll leave it omitted for the time being, but it's good to have it just for the future cases. So going back to the component, we'll go ahead and finish out this little H4 element here. And we'll just say player name here, just so we can see something rendered to the page. And then again, don't forget to export your component, export default to player. And before we go further, let's just make sure everything's working correctly. So we'll go ahead and import it and just plop it on our page here. Next, we'll go back into our player component and we're going to start working with state, a big concept that you're going to hear a lot going forward. It's the main concept behind things like Redux, the library, again, that you might hear a lot of buzzwords around. We're not using that now. We're just going to be focusing on plain old state right out of the box from React and component state. And to set that up, we're actually going to make a variable called state, this.state. And we can say this because, again, remember we did that constructor, the super call within the constructor there. So we'll say this.state and we'll just make an object and we're just going to say name.DeAndre Hopkins because that's a great football player, right? But essentially state is an object that you're tracking changes in within the component. It could be data. It could be a flag that you might want to track, maybe if something's selected or not. Think of a light switch. If a light switch is on or off, it has two different modes there, you might want to track that state. And you'll see the benefits going forward, but it beats kind of holding all your answers into variables that you're tracking all over the place. So here we're just demonstrating setting up state, and then we're actually going to pull that data out of state into our JSX object down here. And so I'm just going to go ahead and say name, and we could say this.state.name, but I like pulling it out in this kind of fancy ES6 syntax way where I'm just using the brackets here to pull it out of state. Say const bracket name equals this.state. It's equivalent to saying, again, this.state.name, but it makes it more readable. And now when I go to my page, I can see it says DeAndre Hopkins. Once you hit save and refresh the page, so now we're keeping the data within state. And so this data could be changed. And so maybe keeping the name isn't a great example because name pretty much doesn't change. But this is a very rough example of using state within a component and then rendering that state. So that's all nice and great and all. But now if I use this player component multiple times on a page, you'll see that we have a bit of a problem that everybody is named DeAndre Hopkins, which is not probably what we want in our fantasy football application. maybe we would want to pass in the name to this player component and then have that component render out the name. So why don't we do that? And we'll do that by actually passing in properties, or what React likes to refer to as props. And it's really simple to do. All you got to do is go to your component and then type in whatever you want to name your prop. So think about an object that you're going to get in the actual component. And so this is going to be the property name. So I'll say name, and I'll just type in or move that value of DeAndre Hopkins and all those other players up here into the component. So now we're passing in the name, and we'll just have one component that renders out what these might look like. So if we go back into our player component, notice we're getting the name from state. If we just change this to props, now the name comes from the actual property object that we get that's being passed into the component. And so if we reload the page, we see that we're still getting the same kind of look. Only now these are much more functional and not everyone's being named DeAndre Hopkins. So let's change what this value is from name to actually something more useful, like is selected. So I mentioned earlier about an example about a light switch, but here we're going to track if a certain player has been selected or not. So in the state, we'll just make a new variable called is selected. We'll set it to false because we don't want anyone selected out of the gate. And then I'm going to pull out is selected from state, just like I do with props. Const is selected equals this.state. So I'm creating the is selected variable, and I'm going to use it down here in my return statement. I'm going to say if it's selected, go ahead. I want to render out some little paragraph element that just says player is selected. And so I can actually use my variable is selected down here. But don't forget, because you want to actually kind of render out some JavaScript here, you actually need to put it in some brackets. And that way it shall be evaluated. Now, leaving it like this, we're not really going to see any change because it's all false for everyone. But if we change it to true, reload the page, we'll notice that everyone's selected. So it's working. So now we're getting this kind of toggleable little variable that we can show some elements depending on if an element or player was selected. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go ahead and define an onClick method here on the div. We'll say this.handleClick. We don't have this method available yet. We still need to set this up, but this is what we're going to call it. And we'll say this because remember we're in a class, so it'll be a method with on this class. We'll say handleClick. I'm going to use the arrow function here. And within this function, we're going to go ahead and change that is selected to true. And if you're like me, you're probably thinking I can just change it with this.state that is selected equals true. But that's not actually what we want to do in React. In React, it has a very specific way how we update state. Otherwise, we won't get a full render and the component actually won't update. Now with setState, we can just set it an object and then give it the new parameters that we want to change, and it'll work fine. Or we can actually give it a function here where we get the previous value of state, because we just want to toggle this based on what it was. So if it was true, we want it to go to false. If it's false, we want it to go to true. So in this way, it's better to use the previous state and make it inverted based off that. So if we go ahead and delete this little s here, hit save, this should work now. We're only based on if we select a component, it's going to flip the value of what it was. So if it was true, it's going to be false. If it was false, it's going to be true. So let's select that, and we get player selected, player selected, player selected. Awesome. So it's working as we expect. And now we have a more kind of interactive part to our component here. But it'd be nice if we could, start to dress up our component or add some custom styles to it. So why don't we go ahead and do that and see what it looks like to add a CSS file. I'm just going to go ahead and make a new player style.css. Right here in my components, you probably organize it differently if the application was bigger, but because we're still walking a little bit, let's just make it simple on us. I'll go ahead and make a class here. Let's not get too deep into what the CSS is. I'm just kind of want to demonstrate hooking a CSS file up. So here I'll give it some kind of flexed layout. So when I select it, maybe it changes how it's rendering or what it looks like, right? So I'll say space around. And let's go back into the player component. And because we're using Webpack under the hood, the Create React app uses Webpack. So the bundling will work with CSS too. So we can just import those files directly. And again, you might do it differently in a bigger application, but it works fine here. We can just say import the player style file. And now that file is being loaded into this bundle. So we can use those class names that we might have defined, right? So I'll just go ahead and say class name. Here I'd put some brackets, but you if it's not being changed dynamically, you can just put the string value. So here I put brackets player container. You could just simply put string player container and work the same. And now as I select it, because we're getting player selected element and our class is being spaced around by flexbox, we get that kind of weird alignment. So it's probably not the prettiest, but it's working, and it's now our CSS file is wired up. Okay, so our application is starting to take a little bit of shape. We made a couple different components. We have the functional component, we have the class component with state in it, we're passing props around, we've got some CSS loaded in, but we still have lots of work to do, so we'll go ahead and continue on this application in the next video.